This is Christopher John Björknes. It is September 14th, 2023. I'd like to thank all the contributors. I depend upon your contributions to keep making these videos and keep this going. If you'd like to contribute, you can do so in the links in the description below, as well as at my website, CJBBooks.com, where you'll also find all my books for sale. There are many very important things which aren't taught in our schools about the Civil War and about the full history between the United States and Russia. And it's especially pertinent today where Vladimir Putin's government, through its press, its state propaganda arms, are threatening the United States with nuclear war, and the United States is supplying the Ukraine with weapons with which to defend itself from Russia's aggression. Vladimir Putin, his entire career, has been involved with the KGB. He's a strong Soviet man, and he has been trying to engineer, and he has been funding and instigating secessionist and separatist movements in the United States. And this is not unprecedented. In the 1860s, starting in the late 1950s, the Rothschild banking cartel, in collusion with the monarchies in England and the government in France, set about to create a secessionist movement in the United States. These powers were worried that the United States was growing increasingly strong, and if it continued down the path it was on, it would eventually overtake the continental European powers and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom and France were closely aligned with the Rothschild family, who had financed their wars, including their wars against each other. And these powers wanted to pit America against itself the same way that the European nations were pitted against one another for perpetual war, perpetual profit, perpetual slaughter, slaughtering the flower of the French youth under Napoleon. All the colonial powers were very important to the Rothschilds, and they essentially ran the world through this network of governments that they controlled through their loans. And they wanted to set it up so that the United States would fight itself and destroy itself and create a division where the North and the South could be perpetually pitted against one another and therefore weaken each other forever. And they tried to engineer it where France would take over Mexico and then assist the South in defeating the North. And the British, through Canada, wanted to control the North after it was weakened and defeated by the South. Now, Great Britain and France remained officially neutral, but France, through the Rothschilds, heavily funded the South, and the Rothschilds, through its American agent, Auguste Schoenberg, who changed his name to Auguste Belmont. Belmont is French for beautiful mountain. Schoenberg is German for beautiful mountain. And he wanted to conceal his roots, so he presented himself as a Frenchman, I guess. And he was the Rothschild's agent out of New York. And historians have been consistently distorting the history to make it appear that Monsieur Belmont supported the efforts of the North. But in fact, as I proved in my book, The Manufacture and Sale of St. Einstein, some 20 years ago, he was a Rothschild agent. He was involved before the war, instigating it, setting it all up. He was involved throughout the war, arranging loans to the South and trying to bring France into Mexico and have France support the South. The U.S. the Union of the U.S. under Lincoln set up what was called the Anaconda Plan, and they surrounded the South with a naval fleet. And both Great Britain and France were heavily dependent on Southern cotton. But and they used that to try to draw France and England into the war. And there was another Rothschild agent who got involved, and he started to make dirty deals with Egypt and manipulating the stock markets to get inferior Egyptian cotton into the hands of the European powers to help keep them going throughout the war, but to always leave it so that there was an incentive for them to side with the South and try to assist the Confederacy to either keep the war going forever or defeat the North. So contrary to what you're taught in school, where it was all about slavery, etc., it was actually the bankers, the British, the French, and probably several other European powers were concerned that America was becoming too strong, and they wanted to slap down this bastard child of England and make it submit to the European powers and to weaken it so that it was constantly fighting itself the way the European powers were constantly at war with one another. During the war, Lincoln decided to fund the war with what were called greenbacks. This was an American fiat currency. It was not backed by silver or gold. It was tremendously successful, and that also posed a great threat to the Rothschild banking cartel. There was someone from Frankfurt, one of the bankers, probably knew the Rothschilds quite well. His father had emigrated from Frankfurt, Germany, where the Rothschilds started out, to Russia. His name was Baron Stieglitz, and he had set up in, I think, 1860 or 1861, the State Bank of Russia, which also wasn't totally under international control and afforded Russia some independence from the international banking cartels. And there were great tensions between the Rothschilds and the Tsar for many generations of the Tsars, and they eventually overthrew them through their agent Jacob Schiff and Kuhn Loeb and Company in America in 1917. And at that time, once again, America and Russia were allies, as they were in the Civil War. So during the Civil War, what happened was Great Britain and France, Great Britain especially had a great naval power, were threatening to join with the South against the North. The Russian Tsar sided with Abraham Lincoln, Tsar Alexander II, who had freed millions of serfs in, I think, 1861, when the Civil War started. Lincoln, I think, 1863, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So these two men had a great deal in common. They were freeing people around the world, and they were under attack from the banking cartel, under attack from England and France perpetually. So they had quite a bit in common, and the Tsar sided with the U.S., with the Union, against the Confederacy, and he sent his fleet and docked ships in San Francisco and New York, and said that if Great Britain and or France entered the war, they would have to fight not only the United States, but Imperial Russia, which was a great power at that time. And that kept England, Great Britain, and France out of the war militarily, although covertly they were constantly helping out the South, despite this anaconda strangulation policy. So let's have a little look at what was going on. The Rothschilds created the bloodiest war in American history. There were close to 650,000 American casualties. They did terrible harm to American culture. They cost many, many lives. They set the South back. It still hasn't recovered from the Civil War. And they eventually got their central bank in the United States immediately after the Civil War. They worked very hard to get rid of the greenback and to get America back on metallic coin standard. And they assassinated both President Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II. And eventually, they took over Russia in 1917. Now, America and Russia had been allies during the Civil War. America and Russia were allies in the First World War. And the banking cartel, primarily through their American agent, who also started out in Frankfurt, Germany, on the same street with the Rothschilds and was closely aligned with the Rothschild family, Jacob Schiff, instigated the Russian Revolution. Despite being an American, he destroyed an American ally. And then Kuhn, Loeb and Company and the Warburgs set up the Bolshevik Revolution to take over the March Revolution with the October Revolution. And they created America's worst long-standing enemy, which is today threatening us with nuclear war. Despite all that, and despite the fact that the Bolsheviks helped the Germans out in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and enabled the Germans to kill Americans in World War I that they would not otherwise have been able to do. Another agent of these bankers, Herbert Hoover, who was to become president of the United States, bailed out the Soviet Union when it was on the verge of collapse and provided them with funding and food to keep them going. And eventually, the communists gave the Russians our atomic weapons technology and set them up so that they could eventually exterminate us as they are today, threatening to do. All of these people have a religious and ethnic common background, and they did terrible harm to the United States and continue to do terrible harm to the United States. And it's very strange that we're not taught this in our histories. We're not made aware of it. We're not made aware that we need to defend ourselves from this ongoing existential threat coming from these same powers. So I feel an obligation to share this history with you. So let's start going back to the characters who were involved in all of this. One of them was, as I said, Auguste Belmont, who was born August Schoenberg. He was involved with the Rothschilds all his adult life. The Wikipedia page on him says Auguste Belmont, original name August Schoenberg. At age 14, Belmont entered the banking house of the Rothschilds at Frankfurt am Main, and he later transferred to the Naples office. In 1837, he moved to New York and opened a small office on Wall Street, where he served as the American agent for the Rothschilds and laid the foundation for his own banking house, August Belmont and Company. Belmont, one of the richest Americans of his day, was a fixture of New York's high society. He was very well connected He pretended to be a Northerner, but he subverted the Northern political parties to make them favor the South. And at the beginning of the war, he ran around in the South, instigating it, providing for funding for it, and ensuring the Southern leaders that they would win it. Another person was Judah P. Benjamin. He stood behind Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and was his advisor and was an agent of these bankers who was leading what was going on behind the scenes. This is August Belmont during the Civil War. However, again, historians have been distorting what actually took place, which I explain in my book, The Manufacture and Sale of St. Einstein. Belmont was very much in favor of the Confederacy. And the Wikipedia page says, however, the evidence compiled by Mira Wilkins in the history of foreign investment in the United States to 1914 tells another story. She writes, quote, a Confederacy loan, again, this is money given to the Confederacy, so Belmont was a snake who was active in the North, pretending to support the North, while at the same time he was actually supporting the Confederacy against the North in this war, which cost 650,000 American lives. In the history of foreign investment in the United States to 1914 tells another story. She writes, a Confederacy loan issued in London in 1863 and marketed in London and Paris was oversubscribed. Young Solomon de Rothschild was in the United States from 1859 to 1861. He was in the United States setting up the Civil War. It had nothing to do with slavery other than the fact that these banking houses made tremendous money off of the African slave trade and was captivated by the American South. He was captivated by trying to wreck the American South and wreck the American North. He wrote home on April 28, 1861, urging the Rothschilds to use their influence to have the Confederacy recognized. He saw the North as totally at fault. The Confederacy loan was also taken up in Liverpool, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. Stanley Chapman calls the loan to the Confederacy perhaps the most audaciously successful loan of the century. Imagine that. 650,000 American dead, countless injured, women raped, homes burned, children murdered, prisoners starved to death in concentration camps. And it was a great success for the Rothschilds. John Slidell, the uncle of August Belmont's wife, arranged the Confederacy loan. August Belmont, the New Yorker, presenting himself as the savior of the North. John Slidell, the uncle of August Belmont's wife, arranged the Confederacy loan. John Slidell's daughter, Matilda, married Baron Frederick Emil d'Erlanger. Erlanger was another one who came out of the Rothschilds, and it was Erlanger who corrupted the stock markets and set up illicit trade in Egyptian cotton. And he messed over the Egyptians, not as badly as the Americans got messed over, but he was a dirty, dirty man. The senior, Frederick Emil d'Erlanger, who was involved in that loan, their son, Baron Emil Beaumont d'Erlanger, would become the senior partner in Emil Erlanger and Company, London, based on a family tree in the Belmont Family Papers, Columbia University. In New York, Belmont helped to organize the Democratic Vigilant Association, which sought to promote unity by promising Southerners that New York businessmen would protect the rights of the South and keep Free Soil members out of office. These were Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats, very different from what the Democratic Party became under Roosevelt. According to the Chicago Tribune in 1864, Belmont was buying up Southern bonds on behalf of the Rothschilds as their agent in New York because he backed the Southern cause. And I was the one who brought that out in my book. I probably was investigating that around 2004. Seeking to capitalize on divisions in the Republican Party at the war's end, Belmont organized new party gatherings and promoted Salmon Chase, the former United States Secretary of the Treasury since 1861. He was heavily involved in issuing the greenbacks, which the Rothschilds deliberately destroyed after the war, after they had Lincoln assassinated. And later, Chief Justice of the United States in 1864, for president in, let's get a look at Chase. There he is. In 1868, the candidate he viewed least vulnerable to charges of disloyalty to the party during the Republican Unionists' Lincoln-Johnson administrations. Once they had Lincoln dead, they began taking over the American political parties. They created impeachments. They created depressions. They did all kinds of horrible things leading up to the creation of their central bank, the Federal Reserve, which was engineered by the Rothschilds' fellow bankers, the Warburgs, so that they could finance World War I and eventually take absolute revenge on the Russian people and on the Tsar, and they killed the Tsar and his family. So, Russian Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs in 1861. He was a very humanitarian and noble figure, and he was not forgiven for helping the United States, the Union, to preserve the Union and to defeat the Confederacy and the secession that the Rothschilds created, just as Putin and the libertarians are trying to create secession in Texas and California. And the Russian Soviets are heavily involved in instigating all that, funding that. The leaders of that often traveled to Moscow to be coached on how to create another civil war in America, which the Soviet Russians are trying to engineer. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are henceforward shall be free. That had no effect because the Union didn't control those southern states, and the slaves in the Union were still considered slaves. But at least it was a step in the right direction, and it foreshadowed the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and the freeing of the slaves after the war. And after Rothschild had Lincoln assassinated. Rothschilds were not only angry at Lincoln for defeating them and defeating the Confederacy, they hated him for creating greenbacks, which were a fiat currency that did not enable the usury which took place with gold, or the debasement and or deflation of metallic currencies. It enabled the government to issue its own debt-free currency. It enabled the nation to create a controllable money supply that was not dependent upon the supply of gold or silver. Gold and silver can be imported or exported into a nation. Banks can hoard it, but a government can always print more money or pull it out of circulation at will to control the money supply. So it is vastly superior to the fractional reserve gold banking that the Rothschilds always favored. Today, we see the libertarians trying to destroy the value of the U.S. dollar at the same time that they're also trying to create secessionist movements, and the libertarians are the harshest critics of Abraham Lincoln. The libertarians are crypto-communists working for the Soviet regime to bring about a new civil war, to destroy the value of the American dollar for the benefit of Soviet Russia, to cast aspersions against the memory of President Abraham Lincoln because he did so much damage to the Rothschilds and preserved the Union. So they are obviously working for the bank cartel and for the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they pretend to be patriots and honor the Constitution. They are, in fact, a fifth column of the same enemies who set up the Civil War to destroy us, and they are party to Mr. Putin's plans to destroy us today. And Putin and the Soviets before him, Murray Rothbard and many prominent libertarians are constantly trying to undermine our currency, are constantly acting as apologists for, it was the first Soviet Russia, now it's Soviet Russia under KGB Putin. They go so far as to go on to Russian state media to bash the United States, to try to diminish confidence in the American dollar, to create the myth that fiat currencies are bad when it was fiat currencies which made the United States so strong, et cetera, et cetera. They're clearly in bed with Soviet Russia. Ayn Rand, who is their hero, was from that same religion and ethnicity that has been working against us this whole time. And she came over as a prominent figure in Operation Trust to present herself falsely as if an anti-communist in order to subvert authentic anti-communists and make them gullibly follow and pursue what the libertarians are pursuing today, to atomize us, to create separatist and secessionist movements, to bash the American dollar, to promote a gold standard today in the form of BRICS, and to do everything to undermine our people, pit us against our own government, all in the name of patriotism and liberty. Greenbacks were emergency paper currency issued by the United States during the American Civil War that were printed in green on the back, were not backed by existing gold or silver reserves. Gold and silver, again, are easily debased. They are easily made deflationary by utilizing the banks to pull gold and silver out of circulation, or to export it, which is even worse, export it out of the country, so that there's no longer velocity to money. Money is hard to get. Goods become cheap, but nobody has any money to buy goods, and the economy collapses. And the bankers did this to nation after nation for thousands of years. They have wrecked nations which have been on metallic money systems by deflating and withdrawing all of the gold from the country so that the economy cannot function. There's even a story in chapter 47 of Genesis where Joseph did this to the Egyptians in order that they would trade their freedom and their lives in exchange for the food that they themselves had produced, because Joseph took away all their gold, silver, money, jewels, and gems. So these are the greenbacks. Right after the war, the Rothschilds started to destroy their value so that they were no longer at par with silver or gold, and they eventually tried to pull them all out of circulation and destroy them, because this was the biggest threat to their international banking cartel, to have governments issue their own fiat currencies. Eventually they set up the Federal Reserve, which they also controlled. But they have constantly, through the Libertarian Party and others, been trying to dupe Americans into believing that the gold standard is the way to go, when it would give them complete control over us and set them up to ruin us. They criticized Nixon for taking us off the gold standard, but France would have confiscated all the gold of the United States had Nixon not done that. And that's another reason they want us to go on the gold standard, is so that the Chinese and others could redeem their dollars and treasury certificates in exchange for our gold. And they would steal all our gold. When our gold was gone, they'd tell it to us to back it with our national forests and our national resources, with our museums, with our government buildings, etc., and then they'd steal all of those by running us into debt. So I hope that this serves as a warning and a heads up as to what is going on and why it is that the Civil War and other things, and things that Andrew Jackson did to fight these bankers, are so very important and so relevant to what is happening today and what is coming out of Soviet Russia, and how they are using people who present themselves as dissident left and dissident right to create this polarized society in which we consume one another, and to try to destroy the value of our currency, as the Rothschilds have always done in the past. In the 1800s, they consistently tried to destroy the value of American currency and take over the banking of the United States. So again, during the Civil War, there was the threat that France, who had already moved into Mexico, would join in the fight with the Rebs, with the Confederates, and try to defeat the Anaconda Plan, which blocked off the shipping and the cotton exports. And they were involved in loaning money so that the Confederates could build ships to destroy that strangulation by the Anaconda policy. And the thing that saved the Union was the fact that Russia threatened Great Britain and France with war and sent ships over to New York and San Francisco in support of the Union. So this hostility between the United States and Russia has been completely manufactured, both in the United States and in Russia, to pit us against one another. These same people created mutually assured destruction, gave the Russians nuclear weapons with which to exterminate Americans, created the nuclear weapons that Americans have to exterminate the Russians, and they have pitted us against one another just as they pitted us against one another in the Civil War. It's completely unnecessary, it's completely artificial, it's completely governed by them, and we can defeat it if we can get politicians in both nations in power who are not beholden to and agents of this same group. The Russians, not the Russians, the Rothschilds had one of their people assassinate Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, was assassinated by a well-known stage actor, John Wilkes Booth. Again, in our history, they don't really tell us who Booth was. Well, attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., shot in the head by a derringer, Lincoln died of his wounds the following day at 7:22 a.m. in the Peterson House opposite the theater. He was the first U.S. president to be assassinated, and he was assassinated by these people, and he was not the last American president to be assassinated by these people. We hear lots of talk today about the Kennedy assassination, but most of the prominent people who talk about it don't reveal who was actually behind it, just as they don't reveal who John Wilkes Booth really was and what his motivations were and who was behind him. The Tsar Alexander II of Russia was also eventually assassinated. That is no coincidence. Both of these assassinations were done on behalf of this same group in opposition to the repression of people in Russia in opposition to independent banking in the United States and Russia, and in revenge for Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II's having defeated the Rothschilds' Confederacy during the American Civil War. Here's some information on what France was up to during the Civil War. The Confederate delegate in Paris, John Slidell, was not officially recognized. However, he made offers to Napoleon III, the emperor, that in exchange for French recognition of the Confederate States and naval help sent to break the blockade, the Confederacy would sell raw cotton to France. And it was Erlanger who got around that a little bit by his intrigues in Egypt for Egyptian cotton, which was inferior to American cotton. Slidell succeeded in negotiating a loan of $15 million. That was back when they were real dollars and they were greenbacks, from Frédéric Émile d'Erlanger and other French capitalists. They were actually Rothschild bankers. The money was used to buy ironclad warships as well as military supplies that came in by blockade runners. So it's important to note that the banking cartel was solidly behind the Confederacy, and American historians lie about that to this day. Frédéric Émile Baron d'Erlanger was born to banker Baron Raphael von Erlanger and his young wife, Margareta Helena Albert. Raphael was the son of a Frankfurt currency broker, Lerb Moses, later named Ludwig Moritz Erlanger. Raphael Erlanger had begun as a disponent in the Frankfurt business of the Rothschild family. It's all a very tightly knit group. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Erlangers, the Schiffs, Kuhn-Loeb and Company. It was all under their control for a very long time. So let's have a look at who John Wilkes Booth really was. The popular but deranged young actor John Wilkes Booth, who heard Lincoln's address on that second night of Passover, understood exactly what the president meant by his timely discussion of freedom. That means, a horrible word, citizenship, he exclaimed to a friend, foregoing his previous plot to kidnap Lincoln. In order to end the war, he now resolved upon another course of action. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That is the last speech he will ever make. Booth belonged to a celebrated family of actors, frequently described as being of Jewish extraction or descent. They trace their ancestors back to Spain. Booth's father, the tragic actor and unstable alcoholic, Junius Brutus Booth, was characterized by his daughter as a man who worshipped at many shrines. In the synagogue, she recalled, he was known as a Jew because he conversed with rabbis and learned doctors and joined their worship in the Hebraic tongue. He read the Talmud also and strictly adhered to many of its laws. Booth's brother, the eminent actor Edwin Booth, was a favorite of the Jewish community, and according to Isaac Mayer Wise, personally confessed to him that he was the son of a Jew. As for John Wilkes Booth, he was not known ever to have identified as Jewish or have been so identified. In other words, he was a crypto Jew who hid his background, which opens up the possibility that these were descendants of Marranos, especially due to the fact that their ancestors went back to Spain. And that could have been Marranos through Dernmay or Frankish descent. As for John Wilkes Booth, he is not known ever to have identified as Jewish or have been so identified in the 1850s. He had played on the amateur stage in Cleveland with various Jews, including Simon Wolf, etc., etc. There he is. That is the man who assassinated President Lincoln to avenge Lincoln's defeat of the Rothschilds, to set it up so that the greenbacks could be destroyed and the American government could be subverted. There's Abraham Lincoln, the man he cowardly shot in the back of the head with a Derringer. Lincoln, who defeated the Rothschilds, who issued greenbacks so that America could be independent from the bankers. This is Tsar Alexander II, who was also assassinated by nihilistic agents of the bankers in revenge for having helped America preserve the Union and defeat the Rothschild-instigated sedition of the Confederates, the secessionists. And we have to keep in mind that we are today under threat of these same people doing the same thing to us, creating secessionist and separatist movements. Because they don't have the power to kill us off, they are tricking us into setting us up to kill each other off. There is the Tsar. There he is after they blew him up. The people working for the Rothschilds were killed the same way that they claim that Kennedy's assassin was killed so that he couldn't reveal what he knew. And these are the ships that the Russians sent over to help preserve the Union and keep Great Britain and France out of the war, and they were successful. And they enabled the Anaconda Plan to succeed and strangle the South. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The Civil War was instigated by the Rothschild agent out of New York, August Schoenberg, who changed his name to Auguste Belmont. It was helped to be funded by the Rothschild agent Erlanger. We are again under threat of these same people setting us up to kill each other off again. Our bloodiest war was the Civil War. They are now threatening us with complete extermination of nuclear war. Putin, who is instigating and funding and training secessionists and separatists in the United States and around the world, who succeeded in Catalonia. The Soviets were involved in Puerto Rico. They were involved in Quebec, in many separatist and secessionist movements. Lenin promoted secessionist and separatist movements. Marx did likewise. They got involved in India. They got involved in Ireland. They got involved in the Ottoman Empire very heavily. And they don't create secessionist or separatist movements in order to generate nations which are independent. Their goal, their stated aim, expressly stated by Lenin, is to pull out these individual nations, which then become beachheads and fifth columns for the international globalist messianic super state that they want to take over the world. So what they do is they try to break apart nations, not to create individual ethno-states, but instead to subvert all ethno-states and make them outposts for international communism until they can eventually take over all the territories of the world, enslave everyone, engage in population transfers so that there are no longer any homogeneous nations. And we need to be wary of what's happening. We need to be aware of what's happening, why it's happening. We need to understand how artificial this war that's going on between Russia and America is, who is behind it, what their aims are, what their strategies are, what their tactics are, and who are the traitors within the United States who are working for them to pit us against one another, to destroy our currency, to shun those great men who saved us, like Tsar Alexander II and Abraham Lincoln, who preserved the Union, who instigated a viable fiat currency that preserved the nation, enabled the nation to arm itself and defend itself from this attack. And they're doing the very same things to us today. So I hope I was able to convey clearly what had happened in the Civil War and to utilize it as a warning about what is happening today so that we can save ourselves from this attack as Lincoln saved us in the early 1860s. I depend upon you to keep this going. Please contribute. You can contribute in the links in the description below. You can also contribute at my website, CJBBooks.com. I want to express my deep, warm thanks to the kind and generous people who have been contributing to make this video possible. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.